to tell you about a day when something pretty remarkable happened in my town of Garrison. You see, I was just one of the town folk when this happened. This man named Jesus came to our town and caused a legendary ruckus. And at first, some of us had heard rumblings about this man named Jesus, how he would heal people. And we thought, well, that was real nice. But then it came to our town, and it changed us forever. You see, there was this man. We only knew him as Legion. He had this tormented way of existing. He would howl at night. I'm not even sure if he could really speak. And yet, he would howl and he would bruise himself. And some of the town folk tried to help him out, and they would shackle him so he couldn't hurt himself. And if we're being really honest, it was so that he wouldn't hurt us. We didn't know what he was capable of. And he wandered amongst the tombs where the dead were. Perhaps we allowed him to stay there because we too hoped he would die one day and leave us in peace. We didn't really know him, we only heard him, and we liked to keep him at bay. But then this man named Jesus came, and he changed everything. All of a sudden, those of us who knew that Jesus was here started to gather, and we saw this man by the name of Legion engage with Jesus. Now, I don't know about all the Jewish laws, for I am a Gentile, but I know that it wasn't right for that man named Jesus to be in Gentile territory, to be near tombs, or to be near unclean spirits. And yet there he was. He approached Legion as if it was nothing. He, I think, got as close as anyone had ever been since he began to be tormented. And I watched this exchange. Jesus engaged the man, and yet the man didn't really respond. It was the unclean spirits inside of him that responded. He was almost a bystander to his own healing. And then all of a sudden, the demons requested to not be just merely cast out, but to be cast into the swines, which also for a Jew was not something he should have engaged in. And yet that's what happened. And then we got really upset because the swines went off the cliff and drowned. And you see, for us, that was part of our economics. So this man gets healed, that's one person, that's real nice, but our whole community gets disrupted because we lost this entire herd. And then even something more disturbing happened. The man known as Legion becomes well. And I don't know about you, but if you have ever seen somebody go from being unwell to well so quickly, it was unsettling. But he sat there and he spoke clearly. No more howling. You saw the very dignity that had left this man when he began to be tormented return. You saw his whole body find peace. And I was terrified. Because if this man could do that and bring about that healing, what did that mean for me? I didn't really want to admit that I didn't want to know what kind of healing I needed. I didn't want to know what kind of change my life would have to go through. And I must have not been the only one who felt that way, because very shortly after, we asked this man named Jesus to leave. He'd done enough disrupting by healing one man and casting out demons. We were uncomfortable. Yet before he left, we heard this man. I still don't know his name. I only know him as the man formerly known as Legion, asked to go with Jesus. Jesus told him no, that he had to stay here and tell about it. I remember thinking to myself, well, that's not very nice, because we didn't want him to stay. We didn't want to hear him proclaim this good news about his healing. We wanted him to go. And yet, Jesus was the one to leave, and we were left with this man to proclaim his healing, which meant we had to face ourselves. When this story is still told in our community today, it still upsets some folks. But for me, it was the day I realized that I had to make a choice about my own healing. You see, I was one of the ones who wanted to keep him in that tomb. I was one of the ones who wanted to keep him trapped in those chains because it gave me a false sense of security. I knew how to be when he was there. But when he came back into town, I had to grapple with the fact that I still wanted him to be elsewhere. And as he told his story, as we learned more about him, I realized I needed healing too. That I needed to be healed in ways that allowed him to be well. You know, it's kind of funny. We get used to people being sick or tormented or in pain, and we learn our role. Sometimes we're the caregivers. Sometimes we're the ones made uncomfortable by that pain. Sometimes we're the ones that just don't want to deal with it, so we move on. And then somebody has the audacity to go and heal. And our identity changes too. We got to grapple with the fact that somebody has been made well, that maybe our role in life isn't what we thought. Maybe there's a new purpose for us. And sometimes that can be scary. One thing I left out of the story is I was one of the ones who would bring him food in the tombs. We tried not to be too awful to him, and so I was one of the ones who would bring him food. My purpose changed when he was made well. I didn't know what to do. Who was I going to bring food to? Would I still be able to have a role in our community? You see, I'm a poor woman. There wasn't a whole lot for me to do, but this gave me purpose. And so when this man became well, my purpose changed. And that was a bit unsettling. And yet it didn't change who I was. It opened me up to freedom. You see, his freedom from being shackled and tormented freed me as well. It allowed me to hear this story of a man named Jesus. And as I heard it, I realized that all of us needed healing. It doesn't make us wrong, doesn't make us right. It just makes us human. And I didn't really like to admit that I needed some healing. And yet when I healed, I saw the man for who he was. I may not know his full name, but I know that he is identified as beloved. No longer the man formerly known as Legion, but beloved. And him telling his story gave me courage to tell my own, to admit the role I played in keeping him captive. I was able to admit how I continued his unwellness and his oppression because I realized that wasn't the fullness of my story. That I was able to then journey with him, telling my story just as he boldly proclaimed his. Because people didn't really want to hear his story. It made him uncomfortable. How could this man named Jesus bring such healing? Was it true? What had happened? It changed our whole town. And then several months, maybe even a year or so later, this Jesus guy came back and he started to preach in the Decapolis again. And I was there the day that 4,000 gathered to hear him. And as I sat amongst the others, those 4,000 who had wanted to hear these words on this hillside, I wondered to myself, would they be here if it had not been for the one we know as beloved? What if he never told his story? What if he was still so afraid that no one would believe his healing? That no one would trust him? What if he kept it to himself? Would there have been 4,000 on that hillside that day? I don't know. But to me, probably not. Because it was his work of telling his story boldly and with courage that allowed others to want, maybe even need, to hear this man named Jesus. He changed our lives that day. Some would say for the better. I'm amongst those. Others would say, I wish he had never come because I knew how to function in the way things were. He disrupted our whole society. He'd put these folks on the outskirts of town. We said, it's at least not as bad as it could be. Be grateful for what you have. And somehow Jesus said that wasn't enough. Ain't that funny? Jesus always went to the outskirts, so I've learned, and brought healing to everybody. What I learned from Beloved that day was, do we wish to be made well? The invitation was already there. It was just whether we wanted to follow it and receive it and take courage to have our lives changed forever. My life was changed forever that day. So I tell my story because it was an unexpected messenger that told his. And the more I learn about this man named Jesus, I realize that Beloved wasn't really an unexpected messenger. Jesus tended to kind of always use the ones that society said shouldn't have a voice. So I suppose the one we now know as Beloved was the exact messenger that should have been, because we didn't think it was. But ain't that something? It wasn't the morally right, or it wasn't the ones in our society that looked the part that ended up changing our town. It was the one who was hurting, who was held captive. It was the one that we tried to stifle their voice. That's who Jesus used to change our entire community. And yet some still didn't listen because it didn't look the part or feel the part, and others just weren't ready to heal. But that's the beauty of the man named Beloved. He still goes around telling his story, giving us a chance to maybe listen once again, maybe receive a bit more healing, maybe not dismiss because of how he once looked or maybe some credentials he had in his past, but for who he was in that very moment, for how he was healed. Healing is a funny and complicated thing. Sometimes we understand it, but more often than not, for me, I don't. And yet, I now worship a God that has been healing throughout time. And so I share my story with you this morning because maybe you were like me. Maybe it was easier to put somebody on the outskirts because you understood how to function with them in that role. Or maybe you're like me and a little unsettled when somebody becomes well and your purpose kind of shifts. Or maybe you were like my whole community that said, at least we allow you food. At least we care for you. Stop complaining and wanting more. Maybe that makes me sound like an awful person to admit that that's the role I played in this man named Beloved's life. But by the grace of God, that is not where my story ended. I got a chance to transform and find freedom and be healed. That I am able to admit that that is what I once did, but it is not where I am now. To admit that as our whole community changed, I got nervous because I didn't know what that would mean for my day-to-day or what it would mean for me and what changes I might have to live into. But I can tell you this, I've lived through those changes. I have found freedom. Not in dismissing the parts of my story that are painful or things that, if I'm being honest, I'm even ashamed of, but by acknowledging that they are part of my story. I was freed in that moment to be part of the liberating story that has now, I think you all know it as the gospel. The gospel changed my life because a man named Jesus did things he wasn't supposed to. He came to an unclean town where the dead were, to a man of unclean spirits. And yet he didn't make us fix ourselves before he approached us. He approached us and journeyed with us, giving us ways to heal. And that's something I've learned too, that if we wish to be made well, it requires all of us. All of us being willing to change and let others change too. It requires all of us to be able to hear the stories of what we actually need. And sometimes it requires all of us to remind each other that the shackles have been let go. And you don't need to continue living as you once had, even if that seems easier at first. Our town changed that day, in part because of a man named Jesus, but far more for a man who once was known as Legion and is now proclaimed as Beloved. Maybe you're an unlikely storyteller like me and Beloved were. And I hope that you too tell your story and change the world. Because there's never, ever enough healing to go around. So take the time, listen to each other, hear each other's stories. And maybe, just in that small act of listening and sharing, you too will be transformed the way we were when we finally listened and heard to the man we now know as beloved. Jesus is ready to use any and all of you, for your stories are mighty and your lives are remarkable. I look forward to hearing your stories one day about who brought about healing in unexpected places. So go in the boldness and the courageousness of the one we now know as beloved. For you too have that same name. Live boldly in your belovedness, for the world needs you. And thanks be to God that you have the chance to continue the healing that began long ago in a town called Gerasene. Amen.